humanitarian aid and for UK nationals like Nadia's family to flee.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the thoughts of everyone in this House will be with those families affected by what is happening in Israel and in Gaza, and I can give the honourable gentleman that assurance that we are doing everything in our power to ensure the safety of British nationals that are caught up in all of this, including my calls with leaders across the region, particularly around opening the Rafah border crossing, which is why I prioritised talking to President Sisi last week, and we continue to have dialogue both with the Israelis and the Egyptians about the Rafah crossing.
Sir Teacher.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to live in the most successful multiracial democracy in the world. But it saddens me, and I think it shames this whole House, that British Jews have been subject to such vile abuse and hatred in recent days. Anti-Semitism and all hate crimes, they fly in the face of British values. And we should not allow events abroad, no matter how horrific they are, to be used to sow seeds of division in our own country. So, whilst I welcome all the actions that my right honourable friend is taking to fight hate crime, to bring people together, may I ask him to consider urgently an immediate and specific policy of revoking the visas of any foreign national that commits an act of anti-Semitism or any other hate crime.
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my right honourable friend, who himself has done so much over the years to fight anti-Semitism. The increase in incidents we've seen over the past week is utterly sickening, and this government will do whatever it takes to keep our Jewish community safe. That's why we've provided an additional £3 million of funding to support the Community Security Trust, and we are working with the police to ensure that hate crime and the glorification of terror is met with the full force of the law. Under our existing immigration rules, we do have the power to cancel a person's presence in the UK if it is not conducive to the public good. Mr. Speaker, we will not tolerate this hatred, not in our country, not in this century.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming the new member for Rutherglen and Hamilton West? Mr. Speaker, the news last night of hundreds killed at the Baptist Hospital in Gaza is incredibly distressing. But it's much worse for the people of Gaza. Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected. Last night, the Foreign Secretary said the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened. I know this only happened last night, but can the Prime Minister please tell us when he thinks he might be able to update the House on progress with that work?
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ali Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House. This morning, I met with the National Security Advisor, but also the Chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. I can tell the Honourable Gentleman our intelligence services have been rapidly analysing the evidence to independently establish the facts. We are not in a position at this point to say more than that, but I can tell him we are working at pace, but also cooperating and collaborating with our allies on this issue as we look to get to the bottom of the situation, and we will also continue all our efforts to get humanitarian aid into the region.
Yes, Tom.
I thank the Prime Minister for his answer. The terrible news last night came as we are still mourning the terrorist attack on Israel last week. Jews taken hostage, mutilated, slaughtered. And yesterday I met the families of some of the British hostages held by Hamas. Every minute of every hour of every day, they hope for good news, but fear the worst. They know the lives of their loved ones are in the hands of murderers. It's unimaginable agony. Israel has a right, a duty, to defend itself from Hamas, keep its people safe, and bring hostages home. But isn't it clear that if Hamas had a single concern for human life, a single concern for the safety of the Palestinian people, then they would never have taken these hostages, and they should release them immediately.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is important consistently for us to remember that Israel has suffered a shockingly brutal terrorist attack, and it is Hamas and Hamas alone that is responsible for this conflict. Our thoughts are rightly with those who have been taken hostage and their families. The distress they are feeling will be unimaginable for all those affected. I will be meeting with some of the families and offering them all the support of the British government to get their relatives home. We are working around the clock with our partners and allies to secure their freedom. And importantly, in amongst my other regional calls, I spoke specifically with the Emir of Qatar yesterday on this very issue, which we discussed at length. The Qatari government is taking a lead and working intensely to help release hostages using their contacts in the region, and we are working very closely with them to ensure the safe return of the British hostages.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I also met charities with staff working in Gaza and heard their accounts of the harrowing humanitarian crisis. Children fleeing their homes, hospitals barely able to function. The lights are going out, and the innocent civilians of Gaza are terrified in the darkness, out of sight. International law must always be followed. Hamas are not the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people are not Hamas. Does he agree that medicines, food, fuel and water must get into Gaza immediately? This is an urgent situation, and innocent Palestinians need to know that the world is not just simply watching, but acting to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
Mr. Speaker, as I said on Monday, an acute humanitarian crisis is unfolding to which we must respond. It is right that we support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. And that is why we have provided a further £10 million in humanitarian aid for people in the region. And we are working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams to Egypt, specifically to the El Arish airfield. We are working with local partners like the Egyptian Red Crescent and the United Nations primarily, and deploying Navy assets to the region, as well as exploring how we can support logistical requirements. And I've also raised this issue of humanitarian access in all of my conversations as a priority with every leader in the region, and we will continue working with them to get aid to where it is needed as quickly as possible.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been alluded to, since Hamas's terrorist attack, our country has seen a disgusting rise in anti-Semitism. Jewish businesses attacked, Jewish schools marked with red paint, and Jewish families hiding who they are. And we've seen an appalling surge in Islamophobia, racist graffiti, mosques forced to ramp up security, British Muslims and Palestinians spoken to as if they were terrorists. Does he agree with me that every member of this House has a duty to work in their constituency and across the country to say no to this hate and to ensure every British Jew and every British Muslim knows that they can live their life free from fear and free from discrimination here in their own country?
Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House can play our part in stamping out those who seek to cause division and hate in our society. We will make sure that we continue funding, as I said, the Community Security Trust, but also the equivalent protective security grant to protect mosques and other places of worship for the Islamic community in the UK. That funding was increased earlier this year. We will also remain in dialogue with the police to make sure that they are aware of the full tools at their disposal to arrest those who perpetrate hate crimes, incite racial or other religious violence. There is no place for that in our society, and I know this House will stand united in making sure that those who do this face the full force of the law.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not want this conflict to harm us here at home, and we do not want it to escalate in the Middle East, where there has been too much bloodshed, too much darkness for too long. A two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel, feels more distant than ever, but it remains the only way through. Does the Prime Minister agree that because hope is at its thinnest, we must work our hardest to ensure the voices of division and despair are sidelined, and that, however difficult it seems, the hope of a political path to peace is maintained?
Mr. Speaker, it is precisely because it is that vision of a more hopeful, peaceful future that Hamas tried to destroy that we must redouble our efforts to try and bring that future about. And all our conversations that both myself and the Foreign Secretary have had with regional leaders, we've emphasised our commitment to making sure that we make progress on all the avenues that will lead towards that peaceful future. And that has been a feature of both mine and the Foreign Secretary's dialogue. And I'm confident that there is willingness in the region not to escalate this crisis beyond dealing with Hamas, the terrorist organisation, but also to strive very hard to a future where Palestinians and Israelis can coexist peacefully, side by side, and look forward to a future filled with dignity, security and prosperity.
This is a crisis where lives hang in the balance, and where the enemies of peace and democracy would like nothing more than for us to become divided and to abandon our values. Does the Prime Minister agree that during this grave crisis, this House must strive to speak with one voice in condemnation of terror, in support of Israel's right to self-defence, and for the dignity of all human life that cannot be protected without humanitarian access to those suffering in Gaza and the constant maintenance of the rule of international law?
Mr. Speaker, I agree. We will in this House speak with one voice in condemning Hamas for perpetrating a shockingly brutal terrorist attack and causing untold suffering on many. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, we stand united in supporting Israel's right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism. Unlike Hamas, the Israeli President has made it very clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, whilst remembering, importantly in this House, that it is Hamas that is cruelly embedding itself in civilian populations.
Andy Carter.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the words of the Prime Minister, and can I commend the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for the work they're doing to find a peaceful settlement in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Prime Minister's decision to provide £12 billion worth of funding for east-west high-speed rail lines between Manchester and Liverpool, and his focus on great northern towns as well as cities in the north. Will the Prime Minister ensure that towns like Warrington benefit fully from this rail upgrade, and that a hub station at Warrington Bank Quay, linking Northern Powerhouse Rail to the West Coast Main Line, remains a key part of the Network North?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaign to improve rail services in Warrington, and he's right. We will be investing £12 billion to better connect Manchester and Liverpool. This would allow for the delivery of Northern Powerhouse Rail exactly as previously planned, including high-speed lines, which would provide better rail connections for the people living in northern towns like Warrington. And I know that he'll be discussing this further when he meets with the Rail Minister.
MP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all continue to unequivocally condemn the abhorrent terrorist attack on the Jewish people and the Israeli state. We fully support the defeat of Hamas and, of course, the safe return of all hostages who have been taken. So too, I hope, do we all share the same common humanity of protecting civilians and condemning any acts of collective punishment against the Palestinian people. In that regard, many of the images emanating from Gaza in recent days will shock us all to the core. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he join with us on these benches and call for an immediate ceasefire in the region?
Mr. Speaker, we believe that Israel does have a right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism and ensure that the awful attack that we've seen from Hamas cannot happen again. And unlike Hamas, the Israelis, including the President, have made it clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law. And we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, my ask for a ceasefire is done with all sincerity to protect civilians, but also to ensure that we have the safe creation of humanitarian corridors. Humanitarian corridors which will allow for food, for water and for vital medicines to get into Gaza, but also for innocent civilians caught up in this terrible conflict to flee. In respect of those who wish to flee, can I ask the Prime Minister what early consideration, if any, his government has given to the creation of a refugee resettlement scheme akin to that previously put in place for Syrian nationals, Afghani nationals and, of course, Ukrainian nationals?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we are already one of the most significant contributors to the United Nations efforts to support Palestinian refugees, and our funding supports around 5.8 million refugees annually. And on Monday we announced a significant increase in our funding of aid to the region, including to the UN, to support refugees. With regard to humanitarian aid, as I said before, we are already working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams into the region, but critically the most important thing is to open up access for that aid to get into Gaza, which is why our conversations with the Egyptians and others are so critical. We continue to work closely with allies to find every way to get that aid to the people who need it as quickly as possible.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, sections of the British media were reporting as fact that it was Israeli rockets that had landed and attacked the Al-Ali hospital, relying on information supplied by officials in terrorist-controlled Gaza. The headlines have since been rewritten, but the outpouring of Jew hate on social media overnight was vile. So would the Prime Minister please make the point again that the way that this conflict is being reported has massive implications for our Jewish community, and that any information coming from Hamas must be treated with a degree of scrutiny and cross-examination that is sadly sometimes lacking?
Can I commend my right honourable friend for his excellent intervention? He is absolutely right that we should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on the appalling situation that we saw yesterday, particularly given the sensitivities that he raises, the impact on communities here, but also across the region. And as I said, it is incumbent on all of those in positions of responsibility in this House and outside in the media to recognise that the words we say will have an impact, and we should be careful with them. We are working with our allies to establish the truth of what has happened. We will do that robustly and independently, but he's right to point out, in the same way as that we don't treat what comes out of the Kremlin as the gospel truth, we should not do the same with Hamas.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate my party with the comments in relation to the deplorable loss of human life, of innocent life in both Israel and in Gaza? Mr. Speaker, having left the European Union, building links and cooperation across the four nations of our United Kingdom can only strengthen the Union. Will the Prime Minister agree with my proposal for the creation of an East-West Council to bring together all parts of the UK family to discuss and collaborate on the trading and many other opportunities presented by the Union?
Can I say, I think the right honourable gentleman made a powerful case in his conference speech last weekend for a strong, functioning Northern Ireland within our union. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has had the opportunity to discuss our shared commitment to the union with his party over recent weeks and months, and I'm grateful for the constructive approach and tone taken in those discussions. I think there is considerable merit in the idea of a new East-West Council to further strengthen the union, and I look forward to exploring the issue with him and his colleagues further.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following my right honourable friend's decision to reallocate funding from HS2, can I urge him to consider a number of projects that will boost the economy and improve the quality of life for my constituents and for Northern Lincolnshire? In order to improve access to the free ports of the Humber, we need dualling of the A15 between Lincoln and the A180. And it is the A180 in particular that causes no end of problems for residents in nearby villages because of the concrete surface. Can I urge him to deal with resurfacing? And finally, Mr. Speaker...
Finally, I'd say I think the AA Atlas has been run out. Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend has been a long-standing champion for Cleethorpes, and in particular the importance of strong regional transport connections. Network North will see Hull fully connected to the Northern Powerhouse network, which I know he will welcome, and also North East Lincolnshire will share in a brand new £2.5 billion fund to support local transport connections, perhaps many or some of the ones that he mentioned. But I know he will also have been delighted to see LNER run a test service to Cleethorpes earlier this year, and I can assure him that DFT are continuing work to see a direct service to London reinstated.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members from the party opposite have said the way to fix the economic crisis that they have caused is to cut state spending by £200 billion and to freeze NHS budget. When will the Prime Minister stand up to the extremists in his party and condemn these ideas?
Well, Mr. Speaker, weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we announced a significant increase of almost £14 billion for the NHS and social care. We followed that up with the first long-term workforce plan in the NHS's history to ensure that we train the doctors and nurses we need for the future. That demonstrates our commitment to the NHS, and we also, I'm pleased to say, reached a settlement with over 1 million NHS workers, including our nurses, for a full, fair and affordable pay rise.
So Desmond Swing.
Aid poured into Gaza in 2005 when Israel withdrew. Enlightened governance could have made a success of it. It is Hamas that has turned it into hell, hasn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this is a subject on which my right honourable friend speaks with authority, and I thank him for his previous work in the area. What I can say to him is, with regard to our aid funding, as the Foreign Secretary will outline later, we have very stringent governance in place to make sure that it's spent on the humanitarian needs which we want to address. But also, I agree with him, there is one person and one person alone that is responsible for the atrocities that we're seeing, and that is Hamas.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, may I associate myself and my party with all those comments that have talked about the protection of innocent civilians today, wherever they may be. A whole wing of Seton Hospital in Devon is earmarked for demolition under this government. The proposal to demolish this wing is an insult to the communities who raised millions of pounds to help fund the upkeep of services at that hospital. The space was given to NHS Property Services, but thanks to the charging policy introduced by the Conservatives, that company is demanding £300,000 in rent. Will the PM let the NHS Property Services hand over the space to health charities and community interest groups so that we can stop a wrecking ball going through Seton Hospital?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman knows, decisions about hospital infrastructure are a matter for the NHS. I'm told that Devon Integrated Care Board are working together with NHS Property Services and local community healthcare providers to establish a future sustainable use for the currently vacant space. And may I also, Mr. Speaker, take the opportunity to commend the work that my honourable friend, the member for East Devon, is doing on this topic too.
Mark Eastwell.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Prime Minister on his commitment to improve transport links in the north. However, to ensure that a complete strategic approach to rail links is achieved across the region, it should include the much-needed upgrade to the Penistone line running from Huddersfield through my constituency in Sheffield to Sheffield. An upgrade which the members sat with me from Colne Valley and Penistone Stocksbridge would also like to see delivered. With that in mind, will my right honourable friend commit to including the Penistone line in the Network North plans?
My honourable friend is a fantastic campaigner for the Penistone Line rail upgrade. I know that my honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, is conducting a corridor development study, given the new commitments to both Sheffield and Leeds, Sheffield to Leeds and Sheffield to Hull, and as part of that exercise will consider enhancing the service on the Huddersfield to Penistone and Sheffield line, and I know that my honourable friend will discuss this further when he meets the Rail Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Bristol South, around a third of children live in poverty, most of them in working households. It's about the same as in Tamworth, where the Conservative candidate for tomorrow's election made foul-mouthed comments about families struggling to make ends meet. This is his Conservative party. He condemned that candidate's comments.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of our record supporting people with the cost of living. Thanks to the actions that we've taken, we've paid half of a typical family's energy bill last winter, frozen fuel duty, boosted the national living wage to record levels, and 8 million people across this country are now receiving direct cost of living payments worth £900. Whilst we're helping people with the cost of living, all Labour's ideas are costing them a fortune.
Mr. Speaker, you may notice that more ladies in the chamber today are wearing pink for breast cancer awareness. But roughly 15% of those with breast cancer are diagnosed with lobular cancer, a little-known strain that's harder to detect, has worse outcomes and no dedicated treatment. I'm working with Dr. Susan McCarlis at the Lobular Moonshot Project to campaign for a dedicated research stream for lobular cancer. Will the Prime Minister meet with us to discuss this and how the government can help us save more lives from breast cancer?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for all her work in this area. Early diagnosis of cancer is key, and the NHS's Help Us Help You campaign is seeking to address the barriers deterring patients from accessing diagnosis and treatment. Thanks to treatments and faster detection, survival rates for breast cancer are now increasing, and last year more than 1 million scans were carried out, preventing an estimated 1,300 deaths from breast cancer. But this Breast Cancer Awareness Month, I encourage anyone who is invited to take up the offer of breast cancer screening.
Stuart Malcolm Macdonald.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the sadism of Hamas can only be condemned, and there's no question of Israel's right to defence and security. But international law is very clear, Mr. Speaker, that acting against international law in response to terrorism is unjustified. So in all of the packages that the Prime Minister has announced vis-à-vis humanitarian aid and the military package he announced last week, can he tell the House how the government will ensure that international law is adhered to beyond just statements from Israel's head of state?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talked about military assets. Let me be crystal clear. The assets that we have moved into the region are not there in any combat capacity. They are there for two reasons. First and foremost, to provide surveillance to ensure that this crisis does not escalate and that arms aren't being sent to entities like Hezbollah. That's what our surveillance aircraft are currently doing, and indeed the next set of assets arriving this week will also help. But also, they are there to provide contingency support for humanitarian assistance as and when required in the coming days and weeks.
Speaker, on Sunday, Terence Carney, a 70-year-old Hartlepoolian, was murdered by an asylum seeker. The people are afraid and angry. Every week, my office is besieged by asylum seekers. My staff are intimidated by young men. The fact is, most of them are illegal migrants who should be expelled. My thoughts and sympathies are with Mr Carney's family and friends, and all my constituents affected by this heinous crime. However, sympathy is not enough. They deserve action, and I am demanding it. Will the Prime Minister take action? Will he make sure enforcement is delivered? Will he ensure that people who have no right to be here are expelled? Enough is enough. I want these people out of Hartlepool now.
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend knows, I'm unable to comment on cases which are currently before the court, but can I join her in expressing my sympathies to families affected? And I would like to reassure her that this government is doing everything we can to tackle illegal migration and the harm it causes by removing those with no right to be here in the UK. We have excellent, long-standing relationships to return people to many countries. We are returning thousands of people more this year than we have done in the past, and we will continue to use every avenue at our disposal to ensure that it is only this country and this government who decides who come here and not criminal gangs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. We have all been horrified at events in Israel and Gaza, and it's right we condemn utterly the inhuman terrorism of Hamas. This should also be the case with any obscenities and war crimes carried out by the Israeli Defence Force. Both the UN and Medicine Sans Frontières have described the siege of Gaza and the withholding of water to its people as collective punishment, a war crime under the Geneva Convention. Yet this week, both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have supported Israel's right to do so. Why?
Quite simply put, Mr Speaker, Israel suffered from a brutal terrorist attack at the hands of Hamas. And it is absolutely right that Israel does have a right to defend itself, to root out terrorism and ensure that such an act doesn't happen again. As their president has said, their military will operate within international law. But what the honourable gentleman failed to acknowledge, that it is Hamas that embeds themselves inside civilian populations, puts innocent civilians in harm's way, and he would do well to remember that.
Crispin Blunt.
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend has been absolutely right to lead the nation in reassuring the British Jewish community in the wake of the utterly appalling atrocity visited upon Israel and Jews on the 7th of October. My right honourable friend, I understand, will be travelling to the region, and he will see for himself the shock and trauma that is through the Israeli nation after this event. And that is shock and trauma that is also accompanied by a rage. And the enormous danger is that the Israeli reaction, led by a Prime Minister who will be held accountable for this failure of intelligence, is indeed amounting to a war crime, and that will not only be a crime, it will be a mistake. And I urge my right honourable friend, there is now no one better placed to urge restraint upon Israel to stay within the international rule of law and exercise restraint on behalf of us all.
Mr Speaker, as a friend, we will always urge Israel to take every possible practical precaution to avoid harming civilians and indeed to act within international law, as their president has said that their armed forces will do, whilst recognising the incredible complexity and difficulty of the situation on the ground. And it does bear repeating, Hamas is a terrorist organisation that embeds themselves inside of civilian populations. It is something we always have to remember, and Israel is taking every practical possible step to avoid harming civilians, and we will do everything we can to provide humanitarian support to the area.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
The Prime Minister will be delighted to know that nuclear veterans like my constituent's granddad John are starting to receive the medals he promised. But John is still not getting his full medical records. His blood tests from Christmas Island, which are crucial for claiming a war pension, are missing, and countless veterans report the same. So I asked the Prime Minister, as the MOD has admitted that it holds at least 150 files withheld from National Archives referring to blood test and other data, will he review those documents, report back to the House and hold a public inquiry into why medical record omissions have happened and on whose instruction?
Well, can I start by thanking all our veterans for their contribution to our safety and security. I'm delighted I was able to announce the new nuclear test medal last year, and it's starting to be received by many people, including the Honourable Lady's constituent. The Honourable Lady will know that I can't comment on ongoing litigation in respect to requests for health records. However, I can say that anyone can request copies of their own medical data by submitting a subject access request to the department, and if they are not satisfied with the processing of that request, they can make a formal complaint via the complaints process.
Mr. Speaker. We appear to be on a downward spiral in the Middle East, which is inevitably going to lead to a humanitarian crisis. The role of Egypt will be fantastically important. What can we in the wider international community do to help work with the Egyptians to ensure that refugees, legitimate refugees, coming onto Egyptian soil pose no threat to the Egyptian state and are not terrorists in disguise?
Good question. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an excellent point about the concerns of the Egyptians with regard to that border, but I can tell him we have prioritised speaking with President Sisi and are in continued dialogue with our Egyptian partners to see what we can do to provide reassurances, get humanitarian aid to the region. We are currently working with local partners like the Egyptian Red Crescent and the UN on the ground. There will be a significant logistical challenge in stockpiling aid at the border and then moving it into Gaza, and I want to reassure my honourable friend and the whole House that is something that the Development Minister is actively engaged in as we speak, so that we can play a leading role in facilitating the provision of that aid.
This is the final question before the urgent question. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The industrial dispute at the Defence Equipment and Support Ministry of Defence site at Beith in my constituency is dragging on as workers engage in strike action for parity and fairness in the workplace. These workers are critical in ensuring that necessary supplies to Ukraine are uninterrupted. But all attempts by the workers to resolve this dispute have proved unsuccessful in the face of management intransigence. Will the Prime Minister personally and urgently use his influence to ensure a meaningful offer is made to these workers in order that this matter can be resolved, further strike action can be averted and supplies to the Ukraine can continue without disruption?
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the honourable member for highlighting the critical role played by non-craft support operatives at Defence Munitions. Differing rates are paid for workers with different skills and qualifications, which is entirely normal practice in both the public and the private sector. This year, a generous pay award was delivered as part of DE&S Pay 2023. It significantly improved the base pay of workers engaged in the dispute, and I am told that officials continue to be open to talks on a constructive basis with the GMB to resolve the situation.
I'll just let the chamber clear before we come to the urgent question. We now come to the urgent question. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
Can I ask the Foreign Secretary to make a statement on the bombing of the Al-Ali Mosque in Gaza yesterday?
Mr. Speaker, the destruction of the Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza is an appalling tragedy. A hospital is a place of compassion and care. This devastating loss of human life is profoundly disturbing, and I'm sure I speak for the whole House when I offer my sincere condolences to the families of the deceased and the injured. The UK is working intensively with our allies to establish the facts. We will not rush to judgment. The whole House will understand that pointing fingers prematurely only fuels regional instability and upsets community cohesion here in the UK. We need a firm grasp of what has happened, not a slew of social media commentary. We all share a duty to be thoughtful and careful in how we respond to reports emerging from this conflict, which can best be incomplete or worse, examples of active disinformation. We are carefully analysing the evidence that has been put in the public domain and other information, and as soon as we have reached a definitive conclusion for ourselves, we will make that public. However, there are some things which are not in doubt. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, set out, Hamas carried out a terrorist assault in Israel unprecedented in that country's 75-year history, and the whole House united in support of Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism. In defending itself, Israel must act with professionalism and with an unwavering commitment to international law. States must take every precaution to minimise civilian casualties and ensure humanitarian support reaches those in need. And I welcome President Herzog's unequivocal commitment, made both directly to me and in public, that Israel is operating in accordance with the rule of international law. By embedding themselves in civilian populations, by using innocent Palestinians as human shields, by launching thousands of rockets since Saturday from one of the most crowded places in the world and preventing civilians from heeding Israeli warnings about future areas of operation, Hamas reveals themselves and their callous indifference to human life. In this tense situation, UK diplomacy is relentlessly focused on our aims, and that is to support our nationals in their moment of need, to push and deliver humanitarian support, and working to prevent the tensions spilling over into the wider region or playing out on the streets of this country. I have travelled to Israel. I've engaged with G7 allies, regional partners, and will be visiting the region again later on today, because we recognise that this will require intensive effort. None of us know how this complex, protracted situation will develop. The government is committed to keeping the House updated, and both here in the UK and in the region, this is a time for cool heads and determination to make a positive difference.
David Lamb.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for granting this urgent question. I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for his engagement with the opposition at this very difficult time. Today we stand united in mourning the death of hundreds of innocent Palestinian civilians at the Al Ali Mosque, a place of healing, hospital, forgive me. A place of healing became a scene of destruction. Hospitals must always be protected. The death of every civilian, Palestinian or Israeli, is an equal tragedy that pushes back the cause of peace. When facing an incident of this magnitude, we all have a duty to act responsibly and judiciously as the facts are determined. Will the Foreign Secretary join me in urging everyone in this House and beyond to be wary of disinformation and to avoid dangerous speculation before the facts are clear? And on the point that the Foreign Secretary raises, will he also update the House on what he's doing to deal with outsized powers that might be seeking to drive division within our own shores? I know that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have rightly said that they are working to establish the facts, looking at intelligence with our allies, and that must be right. We note also President Biden's comments earlier today. Can he confirm if the UK government shares that initial assessment? And I ask him to share what information he can with us, either publicly or on Privy Council terms. And does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that those responsible for the deaths at the Al Ali Hospital must be held to account? Since Hamas' appalling terrorist attack on Israel 11 days ago, Labour has been crystal clear. First, we support Israel's right to defend itself, rescue hostages and protect its citizens. Second, international law must be followed at all times. And third, civilians must not be targeted, aid provided and innocent lives protected. Gaza is in the middle of an active humanitarian emergency. Innocent Palestinian civilians are terrified for their lives. Can the Foreign Secretary today commit that the government will leave no stone unturned in its diplomatic efforts to secure humanitarian access to food, water, fuel, electricity and medicines, ensure the establishment of humanitarian corridors and the proper protection of humanitarian workers, Palestinian civilians in Gaza must know the world is not simply watching, but we are acting on their behalf.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman makes a number of incredibly important points, and I commend the House to listen to the points that he made, a number of which I will respond to and indeed amplify. He is absolutely right that this is an incredibly sensitive situation, not just for the region itself, and our desire to prevent this tragedy expanding into a regional conflict remains an absolute priority. And of course we have a duty as a government, and it's a passion I'm sure shared by the whole House, to ensure that Jewish communities in the UK, Muslim communities in the UK are safe and feel safe and do not experience ramifications of circumstances far beyond these shores and beyond their control. For that reason, everybody, particularly those who have a voice, whether formal or informal, in the public sphere, should be particularly careful of what information they disseminate. They should be particularly vigilant against disinformation, and speculation is never useful. I appreciate that the House and indeed the country will want to understand what is going on in real time, and sometimes the pause that we impose upon ourselves to make sure the information the government provides is accurate can be frustrating, but I would prefer, of course, to be accurate rather than just work at pace. And he is right that there are malign influences seeking to take advantage of this terrible situation. We do guard ourselves against that. We take note of what President Biden has said, but we will come to our own judgment. We will work on that quickly, and we will ensure that our assessment is put in the public domain as soon as we are confident of the details.
Fire of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
As the Foreign Secretary said, we should soon know the direct cause of this explosion. I'll send on to him and the Prime Minister a letter I've received from the Worthing Islamic Society. I think Jewish people and others in my constituency will agree with every sentence, but it ends up by saying, will the government please use their influence and support to encourage a peaceful and sustainable resolution that prioritises the rights and well-being of innocent citizens caught up in the onslaught?
Mr. Speaker, the Father of the House makes an incredibly important point. And as a former Minister for the Middle East, I'm acutely conscious of the implications for Islamic communities, both in the region and here in the UK. And the protection of those people are as close to our hearts as the protection of Jewish people here in the UK. We will relentlessly pursue what is the enduring UK government position, which is a viable two-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians living in peace side by side. Of course, these circumstances are a setback, but nevertheless, we will not be fatalistic, and we will continue to work with Israel, with the Palestinian people and the wider region to bring about that positive aim.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It appears that what happened last night at the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza was a war crime. It was a crime against humanity. And if that is the case, there can be no hiding place for those who gave the order and those who carried it out. Independent investigators must be allowed to find out exactly who is responsible for this atrocity and have them brought before the International Criminal Court. The scene of death and disruption from last night are beyond harrowing, but the tragic reality of this conflict is that innocent civilian lives are being viewed as little more than collateral damage. They are not collateral damage, and every single human life matters, and they matter equally. Israeli, including the hostages who must be immediately released, and Palestinians. Today it was reported that as a direct result of the draconian collective punishment against the civilian population of Gaza, children are dying of thirst. So will the government now finally tell the Israeli government that the imposition of a collective punishment is a crime? It's a breach of international humanitarian law, and it must end immediately.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I note the words he said about the incident, the Al Ali hospital. As I say, we will be making a statement only when we are comfortable of the facts. We have to be realistic that the opportunity for any kind of independent investigation going into Gaza is severely limited, which is why we are taking the time to ensure that we get this right. We have, in all our conversations with the Israelis, reinforced the need for the protection of civilians. They understand that, they agree with that. President Herzog has made a commitment about the adherence to international law. We must, however, be completely clear that Hamas accepts no such limitations on its actions. It has specifically targeted civilians and children. It went out of its way to identify and murder the most vulnerable, and it is completely appropriate for Israel to take action to protect their civilians and prevent Hamas from perpetrating further atrocities in that country.
Yes,
Chair of the Select Committee, Liz Ucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation is unbearable, and whilst the horrors of last night cannot be unseen, we must not look away. Violence across the region is increasing, but also in Europe and the US. We in this House have a duty to protect British nationals. So can I ask what assessment has been made by the government as to the need to raise the threat level by JTAC? And can I also have reassurance about what is being done to protect our diplomatic staff around the world after the heinous attacks we saw on Israeli and American embassies overnight?
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. We can constantly assess the threat picture both here in the UK and in the region. I conducted an all-staff meeting with Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office staff across the whole world. Over 5,000, I'm told, over 5,000 people attended that briefing. I made it clear that as their employer, I regard my duty of care towards them uppermost. We do, of course, continue to support British nationals overseas, including in the region, and our consular team are maintaining as best they can contact with British nationals in Israel and indeed in Gaza. It is an incredibly difficult consular situation, but I can assure her and the House that we will remain as far as we're able to in contact with those British nationals seeking our support, and we are consistently trying to reopen exit routes from Gaza so British nationals can leave.
Diane Abbott.
The Foreign Secretary will be aware of the horror, the missile strike in Gaza on a hospital, which caused hundreds and hundreds of casualties, the horror with which it is regarded, not just here in Britain, but internationally, and also in the region. The House has heard his injunction not to jump to conclusions, but would he support a genuinely independent inquiry into what has happened?
So, of course, an independent inquiry is the gold standard in the event of a circumstance like this, but the simple truth is having any kind of independent investigation in Gaza with the current situations, bearing in mind that our own embassy team there are severely limited in what they're able to do, the international community is not able to operate freely, makes the practicality of that incredibly difficult. We are making our own assessment. We will gather and analyse as much information as we can. We will not be led by any other nation. It will be a UK assessment of the situation. Once we have come to a conclusion, we will share it with the House and the country.
Deming Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure my right honourable friend and the government are wise not to rush to conclusions and to have a proper investigation before they come to a conclusion about what actually happened in this utterly appalling incident. And I'm struck by the number of emails I've had from constituents that have already rushed to conclusions and all blame Israel. Does he agree with me that this doesn't only show the importance of the responsibility of broadcasters to make sure that they do not disseminate false information, but also that those who own social media platforms have some responsibility to try and avoid hate being spread literally around the world at times like this?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend will know that within government action is being taken to ensure social media owners act with greater professionalism and greater consciousness of the impact that they have. And I would make a broad point to broadcasters, and I've had this conversation directly with broadcasters in the past. I believe there is an attempt by broadcasters to try and outpace those social media platforms. The days of breaking news on those traditional platforms is long in the past. They should focus on accuracy rather than pace, because their words have impact here in the UK and around the world.
Sam Turret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My heart breaks for everyone that lost their lives in the Episcopal Hospital disaster last night. It's quite clear now that even hospitals are not a safe place of refuge anywhere in Gaza. That hospital was struck by a missile a week before yesterday. I want to know quite clearly from the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Speaker, that we, as we call the country for humanitarian access to Gaza, to understand why we are not also calling for an immediate ceasefire to enable that to happen. It seems to me bizarre that we cannot call for a ceasefire to enable that humanitarian corridor to happen, because the scale of death that is now unfolding will reach tenfold over the next few days. And in line with that, I'd really like to hear from the Foreign Secretary assurances that you are speaking to our Israeli counterparts to ensure that any Gazans and Palestinians that do evacuate will have an absolute right of return to their lands and do not end up languishing as the millions of other Palestinian refugees currently still do in both Jordan and Lebanon.
Mr. Speaker, I have conversations regularly with the Israeli government and the governments of the countries in the neighbourhood about Palestinian refugees. I'm not able to go into the detail because they're extensive, but he should be aware that we have always supported Palestinian refugees, 27 million to UNRWA. The recent announcement of additional 10 million is a direct response to the situation there. The simple truth is Israel does have a right to defend itself. The truth is Hamas have no interest in a ceasefire. They have no interest in resolution. They have never attempted to engage in a two-state solution. They made every attempt to collapse the Oslo process. They are no friend of the Palestinian people, and they have fired literally thousands of rockets since Saturday into Israel. Israel does have the right to take action to defend itself, to recover its hostages, and the UK, whilst respecting that, will of course always encourage them to adhere to international law and protect civilians.
Dominic Raab.
The Foreign Secretary is surely right to say we must not rush to judgment in relation to this particular incident. Does he also agree with me, though, that there is one fact we know right now, which is that the primary moral and, as a result, legal responsibility for the appalling civilian life loss that we see in Gaza today and in the days ahead, the primary responsibility lies with Hamas. First, for its attack on Israel. Second, for the systematic practice of using civilians as human shields.
Mr. Speaker, my predecessor, my right honourable friend, I know is very well read on this situation. I pay tribute to the work that he did when he was Foreign Secretary and I was his Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, and he is absolutely right, and we must be clear-eyed about what was the trigger event. It was the most brutal mass murder in a terrorist action in the history of the State of Israel. I'm reminded it is the largest loss of Jewish life on a single day since the Holocaust. And of course, Israel has the right to defend itself, and we must never forget that Hamas's actions, embedding themselves in civilian communities, putting Palestinian lives intentionally at risk to pursue their political aims, is completely unjustifiable.
John MacDonald.
Whatever the outcome of the independent inquiries into what happened, the tragedy in Gaza yesterday, the reality is that Gaza is such a densely populated area. No matter what efforts are made, the effects of bombing will be indiscriminate. If the government cannot go as far as calling for a ceasefire, can at least call for the end of the rockets and the bombs. And if they can't go as far to end the bombing, to call for the end of the bombing? Can they at least call upon Israel to stop bombing the south from where the refugees from Gaza City are going at the instructions of the Israeli army? Because this could, a cease in the bombing, could trigger the negotiations that enables the release of the hostages.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the work of the international community in trying to secure the release of the hostages. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, emphasised the work that the Qataris are doing in this instance. They're not the only ones doing it, and we will continue to support their efforts. I hear what he says about calls to prevent or calls to stop the air attacks into Gaza from Israel, but the simple truth is the alternative is a ground assault by Israel, and the practicalities of any, as he said, the practicalities of any military operation in an area as densely populated as Gaza will be deeply challenging. But again, I remind the House that the people who murdered those revellers, those partygoers, those children, those old people, embed themselves in civilian communities, in hospitals, in schools, specifically to use innocent Palestinians as human shields. And we must all understand the culpability that they hold for many of these civilian casualties. But I will, of course, once again, speak with the Israelis about making every effort that they are able to minimise civilian casualties.
Mark Pritchard.
Mr. Speaker, whoever was responsible for the hospital attack last evening, it was a human tragedy and appalling. We think of all those that have lost their loved ones at this time. But can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's commitment to be evidence-led in what the government says about this particular incident? And does he agree with me if the UK intelligence community, whether that be GCHQ, SIS, Defence Intelligence and so on, are having to take time and to deliberate in order to come to a conclusion that perhaps all of us in this place, including media organisations outside of this place, should also show the same caution and consideration before making statements that could prove incendiary?
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. There is, of course, an understandable desire of media outlets to report promptly. That is understandable, but I believe they have a greater duty to report accurately and responsibly, because the words that emanate from the UK are taken seriously. We have huge standing in the world. Things that are said at the dispatch box in this House and on our media are listened to around the world, and therefore we do have an enhanced duty to make sure the words that we say are accurate.
Steve McKay.
Evacuation orders.
Steve McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I deplore the loss of all civilian life, Israeli and Palestinian, and I commend the Foreign Secretary for his caution over attributing blame for last night's attack. Does he think we should also be cautious about the figures for casualties coming from Gaza? They don't describe all as civilian casualties, but there's reason to believe there's a very high volume of Hamas combatants amongst those figures.
Foreign Secretary.
The honourable gentleman makes a very important point. I'm not going to minimise the pain and the suffering of those Palestinian families who have lost loved ones and had people injured. But what we know, just as Hamas are abusing the Palestinian people, they are also abusing the figures that they put in the public domain, and we have to be highly sceptical of any information coming out of Hamas, just as the Prime Minister said that we should be. We remain focused on trying to reduce the pain and suffering of the Palestinian people, as well as supporting Israel and its self-defense. But whilst doing so, we should be deeply, deeply sceptical of any and all information coming out from Hamas spokespersons.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend for his caution in all of this? We should remind ourselves of the words of Mark Twain, which is a lie halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on, and never more certainly was this the case here. I remind everybody, of course, my right honourable friend, that, of course, Hamas bears complete responsibility for everything. Our hearts go out to all the innocents who have died and suffered in this, of course they do. But Hamas is the perpetrator. They have brought this on themselves, and we remind ourselves that when they murdered all of those Israeli Jews in the territories, they filmed them and they committed atrocities deliberately. This was to remind the Israelis of the Holocaust and what was likely to come. So does he not agree with me? Broadcasters should not enter into discursive debate. When an issue like this happens, they should report the facts as known and then nothing further.
Foreign Secretary. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend speaks with authority and clarity on this, and I find myself in complete agreement with him. I have Jewish friends who are trying to keep their children off of social media because they know that they will be assaulted with images of Israelis who have been murdered and whose bodies have been desecrated. No one in the modern era should have to endure that kind of repeated pain.
Lydia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Evacuation orders of the last week have included hospitals and have meant that many vulnerable people are unable to move because of their disabilities, because of their illness. What conversations has the Foreign Secretary had directly with UK aid agencies here and NGOs about that individual situation, and what more can the UK be doing to ensure that civilian populations, including medical and aid workers, are protected?
The Honourable Lady raises an incredibly important point. My department remains in very close coordination with international aid agencies and NGOs. We recognise the practical difficulties of that evacuation order. Highly dense area like Gaza, we completely understand the practical difficulties, particularly of organisations like medical organisations in doing so. But I would make the point that attempting, as imperfect as it may be, to remove civilians from a future area of military operations stands in sharp contrast with Hamas, who are actively seeking to prevent people leaving an area of future conflict, intentionally putting civilians in their way, using innocent Palestinians as human shields.
Sir Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Foreign Secretary and his shadow for their tone. But the fact is that last night, an evil terrorist organisation that murders Jews and oppresses Palestinians was instantly believed in a number of quarters, whereas many refused to acknowledge Jewish babies had been brutally murdered without demanding graphic proof. Now, does he agree that unsubstantiated reports like those that we saw last night may actually cost lives because it helps inflame tensions in an already highly volatile region?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. Everything has a cost, and rushed, inaccurate reporting costs lives. And everybody, whether they are formally involved in the reporting process or whether they are a citizen journalist or whether they are just active on social media, should be very conscious that this involves real lives in the most sensitive of circumstances and could have repercussions not just in the area, not just in the region, but in this country as well.
Hannah Bardell.
Much, Mr. Speaker, we rightly unite to condemn the barbaric actions by Hamas against innocent Israelis. And the loss of Palestinian lives and the unfolding humanitarian crisis is a profound tragedy. The scenes at Al-Ali Hospital shock us all, and I hope he will do everything to ensure an independent investigation. But, Mr. Speaker, people in Gaza are trapped. So what more will the Secretary of State do to ensure consular support, not just on the ground there, but to families heartbroken back here in the UK? And will he hear and indeed heed the words of Nadia El Nakla, the wife of our Scottish First Minister, whose family are trapped there right now? She said, "We are not watching a natural disaster. It can be stopped."
Foreign Secretary.
The Consular Department in the FCDO has got in contact with the families of those people who are trapped in Gaza, those British nationals trapped in Gaza. We can We are providing ongoing consular support. She will understand, and she's the experience of the First Minister, his wife and their family is a very live example of the plight that a number of families find themselves in. Information is incomplete, our access is severely limited, and sadly we have to rely on a number of interlocutors, a number of people over whom we don't have direct control, including, of course, Hamas themselves. But we will continue to support British nationals as best we can until they have been evacuated from that area.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One fact that is not in dispute is that every rocket fired from Gaza into Israel is aimed at murdering civilians, in stark contrast to Israeli defensive action. Last night, there were members in this place, including senior members, scurrying around, stating as fact that this incident was caused by an Israeli rocket. The BBC and other media referred to Hamas statements by Hamas officials, I think they meant to say Hamas terrorists, and they presented them as fact without challenge. This is not only risking radicalisation of communities in this country where we already know there is a problem with anti-Semitism, it is also putting Jews at risk. And I would just urge colleagues to be careful of their comments, given the role blood libels play in promoting anti-Semitism.
Secretary.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point, and I restate my request of all people commenting on this, whether their role is formally within the media or in high-profile positions like members of this House, to be thoughtful of the implications of their actions, to be sceptical of all information coming out from Hamas, and taking the time, a little bit of extra time to verify, can literally save lives both here and abroad.
Rachel Muskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know this is complex, and the taking of life and hostages, whether Israeli or Palestinian, is abhorrent. But we have to recognise that Palestinians cannot defend themselves. They have no means. And now their place of sanctuary, such as hospitals, are no longer safe places either. And for that reason, I just urge the Foreign Secretary once more to call for ceasefire so that we can see a de-escalation of this horrific conflict.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course, everybody, I rephrase that, all reasonable people want this terrible situation to be resolved, and resolved quickly. This was not a conflict that Israel asked for. It is a conflict that they were forced to engage in because of the mass murder in their country perpetrated by Hamas terrorists, terrorists who embed themselves in schools, in hospitals, and in civilian communities. Calls for ceasefires are all well and good, but I have seen nothing which leads me to believe that Hamas would respect calls for a ceasefire.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say to my right honourable friend that whatever the investigation finds out, it's not going to matter a great deal to all those who are dead in the hospital. Whether the Israeli explanation is correct, that it was an Islamic Jihad missile that misfired and then landed amongst explosives that were on the hospital site, which then killed so many people, or whether it was an Israeli strike, in the end, both sides have now committed war crimes. If there are just additional crimes being added to the ledger on either side, that is just simply what this will be. And I say to my right honourable friend, in his relations with Israel, in reinforcing the position of the Prime Minister, is the only way to get out of this mess is a ceasefire, because otherwise we are going to see the relief we will not see the relief of people who are starving, are dehydrating to death, which is a collective punishment, which is illegal under international law, following the deportation of people from northern Gaza, which is again illegal under international law. There are specific offences that have already taken place. And I say to my right honourable friend, all our sakes, work, as you said, with clear-minded determination to get the best answer from our ally.
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the House needs to understand that prior to Hamas's terrorist attack, tens of thousands of Gazans passed through the border into Israel every day in order to work. Israel provided, often without payment, water, electricity and gas to the people of Gaza. That was interrupted as a direct result of Hamas's brutal terrorist action. Thousands of rockets are fired from Gaza into Israel, from in and amongst schools, hospitals and civilian communities. We do, of course, always remind Israel, as we would do with any other nation involved in military operations, of their duties under international law. President Herzog, the head of state of Israel, has reinforced that commitment. We hear no such commitment from Hamas.
Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think last night's absolute tragedy of the explosion at the Al-Ali Hospital will simply intensify passions and also it polarise the debate even more. Many children and young people here in the UK will have seen the images on our televisions and our screens and have read the social media platforms, and I think will be influenced by that. And while I thank the government for the money and the support they're giving to the organisations that are protecting faith schools, mosques and synagogues, I would urge the Minister, and perhaps he can tell us, what he's doing about providing advice and support to ordinary schools and to our universities, where there is an intensification of hatred emerging and where I am hearing of both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic views being expressed and attacks being wrought on individuals.
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, she makes an incredibly important point. And whilst, of course, I won't go into details of conversations at Cabinet, I can assure her that the protection of all communities in the UK was something that the Secretary of State for Dulac highlighted. That goes very much hand in hand with the commitment the Home Secretary has made that we will protect all communities in the UK, Muslim, Jewish and others, and we will work with institutions, whether they be education institutions and others, to try and ensure that the people who are at those institutions can go about their lives free from fear, intimidation and discrimination.
Roman Chisti.
Mr. Speaker, I very much agree with the Foreign Secretary. The entity responsible for the loss of lives that we are seeing now is Hamas, a terrorist, barbaric organisation which killed innocent Jewish people. The question that we have now is, to do everything we can to save lives, both Israeli, Palestinian, Israeli innocent people in that regard. And I welcome the government's commitment to the humanitarian assistance for the ordinary people of Palestine and his differentiation, as the Prime Minister's differentiation between the people of Palestine and the terrorist organisation Hamas. The question I have for the Foreign Secretary is this. Moving forward, he says we will work towards a two-state solution. The people in the region want to know, what is that two-state solution? Is that based on the 242 Security Council resolution on 1967 borders, which the United Kingdom signed up to? What is a clear framework for that? And the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has previously asked for the UK to appoint an envoy for the region. And we have two brilliant contenders, if I may say so. William Hague, former Foreign Secretary, gets the region. Alistair Burt, who's a brilliant former minister, well respected. We have choices, we have options. When will the Foreign Secretary outline that part of the next steps?
Foreign Secretary.
I mean, he makes some very important points, my honourable friend. And the truth is that we remain committed to a two-state solution, Palestinians and Israelis living side by side in peace and prosperity. And whilst that might at the moment in these circumstances feel like an unachievable aim, we refuse to be fatalistic, we refuse to give up that aspiration. The details will be for negotiation, but he will have heard, the House will have heard on a number of occasions that we've said based on 6-7 borders with land swaps and a shared capital in Jerusalem. But we are not going to be dogmatic. What we want is to see peace brought about to this situation. I hear what he says about appointing a special envoy. We have some of our most capable people in our posts in both Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and in Gaza.
Alan Kayser.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I repeat my condemnation of the Hamas attacks against innocent Israeli citizens. We saw civilians in Gaza forcibly moved from their homes with no guarantee of safety or return, yet this government failed to speak out. We saw food, water and electricity cut off in Gaza, yet this government failed to speak out. And last night we saw the destruction of a hospital in Gaza. This government now needs to speak out. Will the Foreign Secretary support the International Criminal Court investigation into the situation in Palestine, given the prosecutor has said its mandate includes the current context, and it so obviously and urgently must include investigation of this hospital explosion? We need to ensure that no more blood is spilled. We need a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire now.
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say to the Honourable Lady that her assessment of the UK government's voice on this issue is fundamentally wrong. We have consistently discussed with Israel and publicly about our commitment to humanitarian law. I would make the point she needs to understand that a military force highlighting a future potential area of conflict and encouraging people to move away from the area of conflict is not forced relocation. It is not forced relocation. And I would draw her attention to the active the actions that Hamas have taken to prevent innocent Palestinians moving away from places of danger. The contrast could not be more stark.
Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, given that we do not know the facts about what happened and whether, for example, this was a ghastly mistake, we should be here not to blame but to mourn the loss of so many doctors, staff and patients at the Al-Ahli or People's Arab Hospital, which I and several others from this House visited more than a decade ago. It was founded in the late 19th century by the Episcopal Church in Jerusalem and run by them to this day, so it is likely that there will have been Christians as well as Muslims who have lost their lives. Will my right honourable friend, whose approach has been appropriately calm at a time when we need to reduce, not inflame tensions both domestically as well as in the Middle East, will he do his best to stay in touch with the Anglican Church to see if they have more information about what has happened to those who were there, to see how we can help re-establish what was a very valuable programme, for example, of free breast cancer treatment and mobile clinics, and to do all he can to think about how in the longer term we can enable people in that troubled land to coexist in a way that we have so far for so long failed to do so, supporting UNRWA as far as possible on the humanitarian mission.
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend, I think is absolutely right to highlight the tragic loss of life in this instance. And as I say, the UK government shares in the grief of those who have lost loved ones, irrespective of their faith or of their community. We know that there are incredibly passionate voices on both sides, but as I've said a number of times, we have a duty to be calm and careful when we speak about this issue, and we will continue to work for peaceful coexistence of all the communities in that region. And as difficult though that is, that will remain a priority for the UK government.
Order. it is my intention to call everybody who was here at the beginning and who is trying to catch my eye. But I have to say to the House that this is clearly a very sensitive, emotive and sad subject that we're dealing with. But it is not necessary for every member to express their grief and their understanding and their empathy. That has been done. Let us take it for granted that we're all broken-hearted about this situation. Let us not now repeat that before every question. This is not an occasion for speeches, it's about questions. And if we can have straightforward, short questions that will enable the Secretary of State to give straightforward, short answers, then we will get everyone in. If not, there will be disappointment. Sarah Champion.
Thank you, there will be an escalation leading to many more civilians on all sides being murdered. I've listened intently to what the Foreign Secretary has said about why he's not calling for a ceasefire. But both as a diplomat and as a military man, could he explain then how we can get humanitarian aid in, how we can create safe zones, how we can prevent civilian loss of life? And slightly longer term, could he also tell us what conversations he's having with the international community about long-term aid and support for the inevitable Palestinian refugees?
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady, the Chair of the Committee, makes an incredibly important point. I have, the Prime Minister has, my ministerial colleagues and of course our ambassadorial teams in the region have been speaking extensively to try and facilitate humanitarian access, most notably with Egypt, but also using our very, very good relationship with the Qataris to try and influence Hamas, and of course our direct relationship with Israel to try and broker some kind of humanitarian access, even if only temporarily. Thus far, that has been unsuccessful. We will continue to work on that, and the additional £10 million that we have allocated for direct humanitarian support for the Palestinian people, we're not limited to just that, and of course we are coordinating with the international community to ensure that whether in Gaza or wider in the region, Palestinians are looked after in these difficult times.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituent, the Reverend David Long, is a priest back in North Norfolk and has also served as a priest formerly in Jerusalem. I spoke to him last night on the telephone, and he has potentially lost friends who were working in the Al Ali hospital bombing. He tells me that there are Gazans who are sheltering in churches. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary to make it absolutely clear in his discussions, please, that the humanitarian role that the churches are partaking in at the moment cannot be underestimated, and that the Roman Catholic Church in North Gaza and the Greek Orthodox Church are absolutely protected for the people that they are sheltering?
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the importance that the faith communities have. And whilst we often talk about the Jewish faith and Islam when it comes to this region, of course, the Christian churches play an incredibly important role, and I pay tribute to them as well. I have absolutely heard the point that he has made, and will continue to speak about the avoidance of civilian casualties, and particularly those places of safe haven like churches.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When seeking to counter an insurgency in Afghanistan over a decade ago, General McChrystal adopted a new concept for NATO soldiers: courageous restraint. This was to separate the insurgents from the civilians amongst whom they lived. Can the Foreign Secretary inform the House how courageous restraint can be urged on all of the combatants, including the full resumption of the water supply to Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
The concept of courageous restraint, which he has highlighted, is now a well-embedded concept in professional military forces, and I've discussed actually with representatives of the IDF my admiration for their professionalism and my expectation that they will maintain that professionalism through any future military operations. Courageous restraint is not a concept in the heart of Hamas terrorists, and we have to be realistic about that, and therefore we will, of course, work with Israel and other countries in the region to try and bring this to a conclusion as quickly as possible. But we do maintain our support to Israel's self-defense, and we do highlight the fact that Hamas are just as willing to see Palestinians killed as they are to see Israelis killed to pursue their political aims.
Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last night, much of the UK media felt it was appropriate to immediately and without leaving any room for doubt blame Israel, before the IDF gave their evidence that the rocket was launched from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It is right that the UK government independently assess what happened, but all of this is made so much harder because Hamas have no morals, no boundaries, no problem with killing any innocent civilian in Israel or Gaza. So will the Foreign Secretary reassure me he knows that standing with Israel now will put us on the right side of history?
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend is right to highlight the callous nature of Hamas's activities, and indeed the activities of other terrorist groups embedded in Gaza. And we expressed our solidarity with Israel in their time of grief, in the aftermath of those terrible attacks. We stand in solidarity with them still. We are good friends with the State of Israel. Good friends speak honestly with them, and we will always do that. But we will always stand beside a nation who seeks to protect itself and its people in the face of such relentless terrorist threats.
Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last night's explosion at the Al-Ali hospital only adds to the unspeakable pain of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza who face a deepening humanitarian crisis, as he knows, unable to access food, water, fuel, electricity or medical supplies. Can the Foreign Secretary tell us when he expects that supplies of these life-saving necessities will be restored to Gaza?
We've spoken with Israel and countries in the region about the humanitarian need. That's why we put the additional money that the Prime Minister announced on Monday. That's why we put that forward. Of course, we do not want those innocent Palestinians caught in Gaza who are suffering because of the actions of Hamas. We don't want them to suffer any more than is absolutely necessary, and we will, of course, continue working with the international community on humanitarian support and with Israel on the preservation of civilian life.
Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I keep hearing the words of my mother through my brain, and have done for the last week. Twa wrongs didn't make a right. Hamas is an indefensible organisation in any person, any right-thinking person's books. But the fact that they won't do right doesn't mean that the UK government should not demand a ceasefire, work hard towards a ceasefire, and to make sure that humanitarian aid gets into Gaza. I keep thinking repeatedly, as do many others, of helpless children. I'm a mother, a grandmother, and that's what I think about every night. Will the Foreign Secretary please make every effort, not just to have money set aside, but to tell us how he is going to get humanitarian aid into Gaza City and to help those who are suffering in Israel as well?
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, calls for ceasefire are understandable, and I have much sympathy for the position she sets out, but a ceasefire has to be respected by both parties in a conflict, and I have seen absolutely nothing in the behaviour of Hamas during the terrorist attack and since the terrorist attack that gives me any confidence at all that they would respect a ceasefire. And unless they respect a ceasefire, it is not credible to demand that Israel do not defend itself against terrorism.
Debbie Abrams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, could I just follow up on that point? The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has also called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Clearly, the Foreign Secretary has some issues with that. I'm not really understanding why, but given that, is it appropriate for a third party, such as the UN, who have people on the ground, and their assessment with respect is probably more realistic than his? In the intermediate time, though, what are the safe corridors that are being proposed? Has the Foreign Secretary considered that so that we can at least have some safe evacuation for Gazans?
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would remind the Honourable Lady in the House that we have people on the ground. My staff are in danger in Gaza. They choose to put their lives at risk in an incredibly dangerous part of the world in order to give me direct insight into the realities of the ground. So I would just urge her to be a bit more thoughtful with regard to the danger that my diplomats, both UK-based diplomats and locally engaged staff, put themselves in. The truth is that I have received nothing that gives me any indication that Hamas or the other terrorist groups operating in Gaza would respect a ceasefire. And of course, I respect the UN Secretary-General's call for a ceasefire. We would all love to see the bloodshed cease, but we also have to be realistic about the fact that Hamas has demonstrated, as have the other terrorist organisations in Gaza, demonstrated over and over and over again a complete callousness towards human life, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian.
Tamanjit Singh Dasi.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, after all the decades of suffering, injustice and occupation endured by the Palestinian people, this terrorism and the scenes of death and destruction at the Al-Ali Arabi Baptist Hospital are truly heart-wrenching. Those responsible must be held to account, international law must be adhered to, and there should be no collective punishment of the Palestinian people. So can the Secretary of State advise the House as to how he feels peace can be attained and about his efforts to urgently deliver food, water, medicines and other aid to the blockaded Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, he and the House will have heard the detailed explanation that I gave in answer to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Shadow Foreign Secretary's initial question. We work relentlessly with the countries neighbouring Israel and Gaza. I will be travelling once again to Egypt to try and work with them to facilitate humanitarian support. And of course, we will work with those countries who are able to influence the leadership in Gaza. So we will not rest. We will not rest. We will continue to do everything we can to try and alleviate this terrible humanitarian situation. And ultimately, he asks, what is the best thing that can be done for peace? I think a good starting point would be terrorists not firing rockets from densely populated areas into Israel.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his clear commitment and true words that have captured, I believe, the collective opinion of all of us in this House today. As the Secretary of State has said, the Hamas terrorists last weekend killed 1,400 Israelis, injured 3,500 and have now kidnapped, it seems, almost 200. The news last night and this morning fill us all with despair. The bombing of the ill and the elderly in the Al-Ali Arab Hospital is reprehensible to the extreme, and it is to be condemned. However, the circumstances of this horrific event are not clear. Does the Secretary of State agree that whilst horror and sympathy is to be expressed, judgment should and must be withheld until all facts are known and clear?
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman, as always, speaks with great thoughtfulness on this issue. And of course, the immediate and understandable expression of sympathy and condolence is absolutely right and proper, but that should not be conflated with a rush to judgment, because doing so has significant effects and, as I have said, can quite credibly cause further pain, suffering and loss of life, and we should all be conscious of that when we speak in the public domain.
Margaret Greenwood.
for the work he's doing to bring home my constituent who's trapped in Gaza. And I note his comments about the consular support for UK nationals. I would be grateful for any further information he can provide with regards, if he can, facilitating the safe passage of UK nationals and the flow of humanitarian aid. And I urge him to pursue these matters in his trip to the region later today.
Well, I can assure the honourable lady in the House that these are exactly the issues that I will be raising on my forthcoming travel to the region. The consular team in the FCDO is making regular contact with those people for whom we have contact details in Gaza to give them as much notice as possible as and when an exit route has become available. At the moment that has not become available, but we will continue. We will keep working to open humanitarian routes and to inform people once they are opened.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We don't yet know who's responsible for the unspeakable atrocity at the Gaza hospital, but we do know that hundreds were killed and hundreds more injured. We do know that yesterday an IDF airstrike hit an UNRWA school where thousands were sheltering, killing more, and we do know that over 3,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza so far. So while Israel does have the right to self-defense, it cannot include mass bombing of densely populated areas if Israel is simultaneously to stay within international law.
Hear, hear.
So I urge the Minister to think again about the issue of a ceasefire. Of course it would need to be worked for, of course it's going to be hard, but unless the UK government gives its backing to the UN on this issue, then thousands more are going to be killed, and we should be on the right side of history, and I'm very much afraid right now that we won't be.
Foreign Secretary.
Israel, of course, is one of the parties engaged in this military operation, but there are others, including Hamas, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others. And I would suggest that anyone calling upon Israel to cease military operations, at least calls on the terrorists to do likewise. But you.
Assad Khan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as hospitals are targeted, medical relief organisations are desperately trying to evacuate sick and wounded patients to increasingly fewer places of safety, while protecting to dedicated staff looking after them. Will the Foreign Secretary confirm how many functioning hospitals are left in Gaza and how Palestinians who are continuing to be targeted by bombardments are supposedly to receive life-saving medical treatment?
Foreign Secretary.
I mean, the simple truth of the matter is I don't know the status of the medical facilities in Gaza. We do want them to be protected. We've made that clear, and we will continue to do so in all future engagements and conversations that we have with Israel. And we will, of course, call upon Hamas and the other terrorist organisations to remove themselves from the proximity of those hospitals if they're conducting military operations.
Hal Williams.
The UN reports that the last water treatment desalination plants in Gaza has shut down. At the same time, people are drinking contaminated tap water, polluted seawater. Now, the WHO says that people need 50 litres of water a day, and people in Gaza are surviving on 3. So, can you tell me what practical steps are being taken to ensure the resumption of fuel supplies to water treatment works in Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
I mean, the situation with regard to the provision of electricity, gas and water from Israel to Gaza, of course, is an important one. We have spoken with Israel about this. He makes the point, actually, that Gaza did have its own water production capabilities. We saw videos posted by Hamas proudly demonstrating how water pipes funded by European aid were being ripped up and turned into rockets to fire into Israel. So whilst, of course, we speak with Israel about the support to the Palestinians in Gaza and our own support to the Palestinians in Gaza, we must not overlook the fact that Hamas has habitually persecuted, punished and oppressed Palestinian people in Gaza.
Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've already seen one Iranian terror proxy, Hamas, launch attacks against Israel in the past 11 days. But we know that another Iranian proxy, Hezbollah, is waiting in the wings to attack Israel from the north, and indeed this may have already started. What steps is the government taking to deter Hezbollah from seeking to attack or otherwise undermine Israel at this most difficult time?
The Honourable Lady makes an incredibly important point. The United States of America and the United Kingdom have put naval assets in the eastern Mediterranean. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said at Prime Minister's questions, that is not to conduct military operations. It is to conduct surveillance operations to prevent Iran or indeed anyone else supplying Hezbollah with lethal aid that might be used against Israel.
Stephen Ferry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In recognising Israel's right to self-defence against Hamas's brutal terrorism, the government has rightly cited international humanitarian law. However, it does seem to be the position of the government that so far has not yet been broken. And indeed, the Foreign Secretary today has several times cited President Herzog to that effect. By contrast, we have a number of UN agencies and actors, NGOs and international lawyers all saying that collective punishment is a clear breach of international humanitarian law, including, for example, the cutting off of supplies and also forced movements of people, and frankly, forcing people to leave their homes because they're under threat of bombing or hospitals is a forced movement. How does the Foreign Secretary address those contradictions in the UK government's position?
Foreign Secretary.
There are no contradictions in the UK government's position. I've set out the government's position. He may disagree with it. Others indeed may disagree with it. There are no contradictions.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. The terror attack on Israeli citizens and the subsequent abduction was brutal and evil. The scenes from Al-Hali hospital last night on the television were beyond comprehension upsetting. And the impending humanitarian crisis in Gaza, it goes without saying we have to do everything we can to stop that from happening. But I'm really concerned, and I'm sure the Foreign Secretary is, that the conflict between Israel and Hamas does not spill over into the streets of any community in the United Kingdom. My home city, Manchester, is welcoming of Muslim and Jew alike. What more is the government doing to make sure that the catastrophe in the Middle East does not end up on the streets of Britain?
The honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point, and I can give him and the House our commitment to protect all communities in the United Kingdom. No one should be held responsible for actions happening thousands of miles away. They have an absolute right to live in peace and security here in the UK. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and the rest of the government are absolutely committed to doing everything we can to protect all people of whatever faith or community here in the UK.
Kenny McCaskill.
100 years on from St Adonam's Law of the Innocents to protect women and children in conflict, both the terror of Hamas and the utterly disproportionate and illegal response by Israel stain our modern world. Rather than the supine acceptance of Israeli-US policy, will the Secretary of State instead heed the wise counsel of President Higgins of Ireland and seek both an immediate ceasefire and indeed justice for the Palestinian people?
Secretary of State.
UK foreign policy is set in London, not in Washington, not in Dublin, London.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has talked about accountability and accuracy in broadcasts and social media. I just wondered if he shared my bafflement at why the BBC, our national broadcaster, has repeatedly refused to describe Hamas as a terrorist organisation when they are a prescribed terrorist group.
Foreign Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I am baffled, genuinely baffled by this. I understand, when the BBC say that to do so would take sides. I fundamentally disagree with that. They have used the word terrorist in a number of occasions, both domestically and internationally. I just cannot understand why they cannot bring themselves to describe Hamas as terrorists, because that is what they are.
Munira Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's absolutely imperative that we get to the bottom of the terrible tragedy that unfolded at Al-Ali Hospital last night and hold whoever was responsible accountable. Having visited the region last year, I saw and heard just how difficult it is to provide medical care to the Palestinians. And now hospitals across Gaza face running out of food, fuel, water. Several have evacuation orders that the WHO have stated patients will not survive. So can I urge the Foreign Secretary once again, will he join the UN in calling for the immediate resumption of essential supplies to Gaza in line with international humanitarian law, which he says he keeps calling for?
Secretary.
The Honourable Lady repeats a question that's been asked a number of times in the House, and she will have heard the answers that I've given on each of those previous occasions.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The grief and loss of millions in Gaza and in Israel was just added to by the horrific and heinous attack on the Al-Ali Hospital. I was really pleased that Foreign Secretary and Shadow Foreign Secretary both reiterated our commitment to international law and the importance to bring those who commit war crimes to justice, but equally not to rush to judgment on war crimes. We have our own staff, we have international humanitarian agencies on the ground in hospitals in Gaza. What is the Foreign Secretary doing to ensure that hospitals can carry on treating innocent civilians, working with the UN, with the International Red Cross and hospitals in Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
We do, of course, speak with Israel, and as I've said, we call upon them to use the professionalism of which they are understandably proud in this circumstance, to minimise civilian casualties and ensure that where possible civilian infrastructure, particularly schools, hospitals, religious sites, are not damaged. But again, it is not by accident that Hamas habitually embed their terrorist operations from those very places, making the lives of Palestinians inevitably far more dangerous than otherwise they would need to be.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the UK Government for the announcement of an extra £10 million of aid for Gaza? But frankly, it will be of no use to the civilians who are trapped and injured there if it just piles up at the border. Therefore, can he tell me what analysis his officials have conducted of the legality of the Israeli authorities' order to restrict water, food, fuel and electricity to Gaza, and what analysis his officials have conducted of the legality of their order to 1.1 million Palestinian civilians in northern Gaza to evacuate south? Questions of legality, please, Foreign Secretary.
Foreign Secretary.
She will know that legal advice within Department is for ministers in order to inform our decision-making. The broader point is that we, of course, want to see Palestinians to end the suffering that they are experiencing. The best way of doing that is to remove the yoke of Hamas from their shoulders, and that is why we do support, within the framework of international law, Israel's right to self-defence.
Simon Mulhaughton.
Hundreds of my constituents have written to me in horror at the attacks that happened. Holding catastrophe in Gaza, with one having 25 members of their family in Gaza. The Al-Ali Hospital is one of 22 hospitals in northern Gaza, and with hundreds killed last night, with children writing their names on their palms of their hands, with mothers giving birth in the street as their homes are destroyed and now hospitals are damaged. Can the Foreign Secretary update the House on action being taken with international partners now to ensure that hospitals and medical staff are being protected, because he has said today he is not sure of the situation with hospitals, that mothers and pregnant mothers, with 50,000 estimated in Gaza, there is a plan for their healthcare, and to update the House on his confidence that that is being dealt with and that urgent medical and humanitarian supplies are getting through.
Foreign Secretary.
As I said previously to the House, in a fast-evolving situation during a conflict like this, it is incredibly difficult to have an up-to-date assessment on the ability of medical facilities in Gaza to maintain operations. We do, of course, want to see civilians protected. We want to see civilian infrastructure protected. But I say again to the House, this is made infinitely more difficult in a situation like this because Hamas and other terrorist organisations specifically embed themselves in that civilian infrastructure. Of course, we want civilians and civilian infrastructure to be protected wherever possible. This is something we have communicated to Israel, but again, the habits, the long-standing habit of terrorist organisations to embed themselves in civilian infrastructure makes this infinitely harder.
Deirdre Brott.
Speaker, I welcome the Foreign Secretary's recognition of the need for caution before leaping to conclusions, given the difficulty in situations of crisis of verifying information. But will he commit to personally making contact with different social media and technology companies, urging them directly to help prevent the spread of disinformation and prevent any information war around this horrific situation?
I won't commit to do that personally, but I know that the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport takes this incredibly seriously. We will, of course, we are taking action to try and improve professionalism in social media platforms. So whilst I personally won't be doing that directly, I know that this is being done and will continue to be done by the government.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At this tragic time, I am of course driven by my desire for peace and the protection of innocents, and while this tragic war continues, will the Secretary of State do everything he can to ensure international law is followed, which includes, of course, the protection of hospitals, medical professionals and civilians, and humanitarian aid to Gaza? But this war will only end with dialogue. So will the Secretary of State also do everything he can to keep that flame of hope alive for a negotiated peace settlement and make this a priority for his government, even when at times it feels like such a very distant hope?
Foreign Secretary.
She's absolutely right about not losing our desire to bring genuine, sustainable peace. And as I've said, this might feel, in this particularly difficult times, like a very far off, indeed an impossible aspiration, but we will remain relentlessly focused on bringing a lasting, sustainable peace for the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, and indeed the wider region. So I can give her that assurance that whilst dealing with the immediate challenges, we will also keep that long-term aspiration in the forefront of our minds.
Jonathan Edwards.
Madam Deputy Speaker, will the British Government support the motion by Brazil later today at the UN Security Council calling for a humanitarian ceasefire? And if not, what are the grounds for not supporting the motion, as the Brazilian text does include a criticism of Hamas, which the Russian text didn't on Monday? And if Hamas refuses to order the ceasefire, as he fears, would they not be seen in the eyes of the world as not protecting the people they purport to represent?
I've spoken to the Brazilian Minister about the UN Security Council resolution text. We are liaising closely with them and others. I won't be able to give a commitment about our voting decision until the text is closed and the negotiations have concluded.
Flora Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I visited Israel and Palestine 3 weeks ago with a group of MPs. And we met with aid workers and health workers who say their last goodbyes to their family every morning because they don't know if they're going to return. It is urgent to support them, and the UK public are being very generous in response to appeals. In the absence of humanitarian corridors, and I do support the Foreign Secretary in arguing for them, can the Secretary of State update the House on efforts to work with UK-based agencies who are on the ground in Gaza with support for mobile health clinics, medicines, food and water in Gaza?
Secretary.
Well, the distribution plan for the additional £10 million that the Prime Minister announced on Monday is still being worked upon, but I can assure her that we have very, very close relationships with NGOs and aid organisations based in the UK and operating in Gaza and the region, and we will of course be liaising with them both in terms of getting an up-to-date understanding of the situation on the ground and maximising our support to the Palestinian people.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The most urgent priority must be to prevent the loss of any more civilian lives. To do so, the UN General Secretary has called for an immediate ceasefire. Leading humanitarian agencies like Oxfam have also called for this. Surely the government must add its voice to this, because if not, isn't he accepting that many thousands more will die? And will the Foreign Secretary withdraw his earlier remarks that what is going on is not forced relocation? Because if he doesn't, I believe he'll come to regret those remarks later.
Foreign Secretary.
Look, of course, all of us want to see an end to the lives that have been lost. But we also recognise that Israel feels the need to take action to protect the lives of its citizens from the attacks emanating from Hamas and other terrorist organisations in Gaza. And we have always said in our support for that activity, we do call upon them to abide by humanitarian law, as their president has committed to do so.
Carol Monaghan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we do need swift confirmation of who is responsible for the devastating attack on El Ali Arabi Hospital, but of course the immediate priority is humanitarian support for those affected. The £10 million pledged by UK government is genuinely welcome, but can the Foreign Secretary explain to the House how that aid is going to get to those affected when Israel has closed all humanitarian corridors?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the situation is that at the moment, of course, all humanitarian support going to Gaza is severely limited. There was an open border, there was a fluid border between Israel and Gaza. As I said, tens of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza, tens of thousands of Gazans, worked in Israel on a daily basis and moved to and fro from Gaza into Israel. That crossing had to be closed, as did the Rafah crossing with Egypt in response to the terrorist attacks that were perpetrated against Egypt. We are against Israel, sorry. We are working with the Israeli government, with the Egyptian government and with the international community to try and open up humanitarian corridors, and we'll continue to do so.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the level of conflicting information and indeed the disinformation coming from Gaza, the irresponsible reporting and indeed actually coming from